Recognize myself for 5 minutes, and I'll first ask Mr. Berman and Mr. Dubowitz if you could respond to the statement recently of National Security Advisor Susan Rice, who admitted, I guess, that some portion of the $150 billion that will accrue back to the Islamic Republic of Iran as part of the sanctions relief could be or would be spent to support international terrorism. So the question is to what extent you believe that these, and again, $150 billion is an estimate, but to what extent do you believe that any of these funds would be used to enhance the capabilities of their terrorist proxies, including Hezbollah, including the Houthi rebels that were mentioned earlier today in Yemen, to bring terror not just to the region, but to American citizens?
Thank you, sir. So I think the best way to illustrate the concerns that I have with regard to the fungible nature of the money that Iran will get is to harken back to the experience that U.S. Congress and the U.S. government had with post-Soviet Russia in the 1990s. During that decade, we implemented a program called Cooperative Threat Reduction, colloquially known as NULUGR, to help the post-Soviet Russian Federation dismantle both conventional and unconventional weaponry, including ballistic missiles. The investment at the time, and I believe it was somewhere on the order of $600 million, was intended to widen the pie, so to speak, with regard to Russia's ability to execute dismantlement that it needed to do anyway. That was at least the rationale that was given. What was discovered belatedly was that the Russian government had allocated a certain percentage of its defense budget for this dismantlement, and an infusion of American cash was not sufficient to widen the pie. Rather, that money was used for other things, including a revival of the Russian bioweapons program in the late 1990s. I think the same concern is germane here. The sanctions relief, and the scope is indeed enormous. It's certainly not a Marshall Plan of the 1940s, which was $800 billion for all of Europe, but $100 billion for one individual country is still an awfully large sum of money. There is that concern that that money will, even if it's spent overwhelmingly on domestic affairs, will free up other dollars that will be spent on terror, perhaps significantly so.
Mr. Berman, do you concur?
Mr. Dubowitz, yeah, I do.
Dubowitz, I'm sorry.
Concur with Mr. Berman. I think we also need to talk about economic relief. It's much more than $100 billion. It's much more than $150 billion. We're talking about economic relief that will allow Iran to sell 2.5 million barrels a day, which will increase its revenues about $15 to $20 billion a year. Opens up its auto sector, which represent about 10% of the GDP of Iran, its petrochemical sector. We're talking about hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars over time. Now, I agree with Mr. Berman and I agree with Mr. Nephew. I don't think Iran is going to spend all of its money on terrorism. Iran will spend some of its money on terrorism, and a small percentage of hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars means that Iran can keep Bashar Assad in power for more time. It cost Iran about $6 billion a year, according to the U.S. Special Envoy on Syria, to keep Bashar Assad in power, not to mention the hundreds of millions of dollars available for Hezbollah and other terrorist organizations. But picking up on a point that Mr. Nephew made, the problem is Iran is also going to spend its money on its economy, and not just on growth and diminishing unemployment, but on economic resiliency. See, the Iranians learned from 2012, 2013, when we were hitting them with asymmetric shocks to their economy that plunged them into a severe recession. They don't want to be in a situation again where their economy is fragile. So they will keep substantial foreign exchange reserves in place and build up the kind of resilience they need down the line so that when we try to snap back our sanctions, it will not have the kind of asymmetric impact that it had on Iran at that time. Economic resiliency is their rainy day fund. That's what they're thinking of down the line when they have an industrial-sized nuclear program with near-zero breakout, and we try to use economic leverage in the future to peacefully enforce the deal. I believe we will diminish our peaceful enforcement of this deal, and we will leave the future president with two options: accept an Iranian nuclear weapon or use military force to forestall that possibility, which is why this deal makes the war more likely, and when that war comes, Iran will be stronger, and the consequences will be more severe.
Thank you. Mr. Perlis, briefly, if you can, the Beirut barracks bombing, 1983. Right. Many of those Marines were residents of Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, some of their families, constituents of mine. They have an open judgment against Iran for their connection.
Correct.
How do we bring closure to families like those?
Two-track process, sir. First, we have this $1.9 billion of illicit Iranian funds that we captured in New York. That money is almost ready for distribution. The Supreme Court has solicited the views of the Solicitor General of the United States with respect to the underlying statute that Congress passed to help us get at those funds. The statute is facially constitutional. If the committee could assure that the Solicitor General promptly issues its statement of interest to the court affirming the constitutionality of that statute, we should be able to proceed with releasing those funds this fall.
Thank you.
Second issue, and one that is far more serious from its implications, are what are referred to as movement of funds by book entry. That process can simply be described as if you have $1 billion in a bank account in New York, and one day it's owned by a commercial company, and the next day that $1 billion belongs to the Islamic Republic of Iran, but instead of moving money by SWIFT back and forth, you simply keep track of who's earning the benefit of that money by a book entry sitting in a bank in Luxembourg. You are able to entirely avoid sanctions.
Mr. Provost, I'm out of time. Maybe we can get back to this in the second round of questioning if that's possible, but I want to recognize the ranking member of the task force, Mr. Lynch, for 5 minutes.